The interrogation room in DuPage County was colder than it needed to be, the kind of institutional chill that seeps into your hands and makes you aware of every small movement. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. On one side of the metal table sat a man who had spent his career listening to other people's secrets. On the other side sat a detective who had begun to understand just how carefully those secrets had been chosen.
You chose students who felt invisible. You looked for the ones who stayed after class, who ate lunch alone, who stopped raising their hands. You positioned yourself as the only adult who really saw them. That's not a crime, Mr. Harper, but what you did after that was.
That's not a crime. Listening isn't illegal. Encouraging independence isn't illegal. If anything, I helped them find their strength.
By the time anyone questioned Daniel Harper's methods, 3 students had already disappeared from Westbridge High School. There were no broken windows, no signs of struggle, no late-night screams echoing through quiet cul-de-sacs, just bedrooms left tidy and phones that went straight to voicemail. In a town where nothing truly bad was supposed to happen, absence felt more disturbing than violence ever could. Westbridge, Illinois sits just outside Chicago, far enough from the city to feel safe but close enough to claim its ambition. The lawns are trimmed, the school rankings are strong, and the Parent-Teacher Association meetings are always well attended. People move there for stability, for predictability, for the quiet reassurance that their children will grow up protected. It is the kind of suburb where trust is not questioned because it has never needed to be. Westbridge High School stood at the center of that trust, a red brick building with banners celebrating state championships and academic awards. Guidance counselors were considered allies, not authority figures to fear. They were the adults who helped teenagers navigate college applications, heartbreaks, and the slow pressure of growing up. And for nearly 8 years, Daniel Harper had been the most trusted counselor in that building.
He was calm, that's what everyone said. When my daughter felt overwhelmed about grades, he'd sit with her for an hour and just listen. He never rushed her, never judged her, and he always told us she had potential. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have someone like him at the school.
Daniel Harper was in his late 30s, soft-spoken and deliberate in his movements. He wore muted ties and kept a small fern on the corner of his desk, a detail students later described as oddly comforting. His office lights were dimmer than the rest of the hallway, and he encouraged students to close the door during their sessions. Privacy, he would say gently, is where honesty begins. Teachers praised him for taking on the difficult cases, the kids who skipped class or withdrew from social circles. Parents thanked him for late-night emails and carefully worded reassurances. Students hugged him in the hallway after college acceptance letters arrived. What no one noticed was how carefully he chose who needed him most.
He didn't target the top of the class or the loudest troublemakers. He focused on the middle, the ones who could slip through cracks without triggering alarms. Students who were smart enough to function but lonely enough to confide. That pattern only becomes obvious in hindsight.
Emily Raines was 17 when she first began staying after school more frequently. She had always been responsible, the kind of student who color-coded her planner and volunteered at community drives. But during her junior year, her friends said something shifted. She stopped sitting at their usual lunch table and started spending more time in the counseling office.
She told me he understood her in a way other adults didn't. She said he didn't see her as a kid, he saw her as someone on the edge of becoming something bigger. At first, that sounded positive. We were all stressed about SATs and college applications, so having someone validate that felt important.
Emily's parents described her as driven but sensitive, someone who internalized criticism more deeply than she let on. When she mentioned feeling pressure, they encouraged her to speak with Mr. Harper. It seemed responsible, even proactive. After all, what harm could come from talking to a school counselor?
A few weeks before she disappeared, she started saying strange things. She said some people didn't want her to grow, that they were more comfortable with her staying small. We assumed she meant teachers who underestimated her, or maybe even us, pushing too hard. We never imagined she meant something else.
The morning Emily was reported missing, her room looked untouched. Her laptop was gone, along with a few changes of clothes and a small envelope of cash from her desk drawer. There was no note, no dramatic goodbye. The police initially classified it as a likely runaway case, citing academic stress and possible depression.
In the first 48 hours, there was nothing to suggest foul play. No suspicious vehicle sightings, no threatening messages. We interviewed friends, teachers, and family members, and the story was consistent. She had been overwhelmed, possibly unhappy, maybe even searching for space.
At a school assembly held 2 days later, Daniel Harper stood at the podium with his head slightly bowed. He spoke about resilience, about the importance of community support, and about hope. Some students said his voice cracked when he mentioned Emily's name. In a room filled with uncertainty, he appeared heartbroken.
He cried, I remember that clearly. He said Emily had so much potential and that sometimes bright students feel unseen. It felt genuine. If anything, it made us trust him more because he seemed just as lost as the rest of us.
Weeks passed without progress, and life at Westbridge slowly resumed its rhythm. Emily's locker was cleared quietly, her name fading from daily announcements. But in subtle ways, her absence lingered. Students glanced more often at the counseling office door, as if expecting answers to emerge from behind it. Then 3 months later, another student vanished. Marcus Lee was 16, a varsity athlete with a broad smile and a reputation for easy confidence. He wasn't known for isolation or academic distress. If Emily's disappearance could be explained as emotional pressure, Marcus's left fewer convenient narratives.
Marcus didn't fit the same profile on the surface. He had friends, played basketball, and had no documented history of depression. But when we dug deeper, we found he'd been meeting with Mr. Harper regularly. The stated reason was identity exploration, something about personal growth and future planning.
Marcus never told us he was struggling. He mentioned college and scholarships, but nothing about feeling trapped or misunderstood. After he disappeared, we found emails from Mr. Harper encouraging him to consider what freedom might look like outside the expectations placed on him. It sounded supportive, but something about the wording felt off.
Just like Emily, Marcus left without signs of force. A backpack was missing, along with some savings from a summer job. His phone was powered off and never reactivated. Police began to feel the weight of coincidence pressing into something heavier.
2 students from the same high school, both connected to the same counselor, both leaving voluntarily without clear explanation. On paper, it still wasn't a crime. Teenagers run away. They make impulsive decisions. But patterns don't lie, and this pattern was tightening.
What investigators would later realize was that Daniel Harper's approach followed a quiet progression. He began with empathy, listening without interruption and mirroring each student's frustrations. Over time, he introduced subtle reframes, small shifts in language that positioned outside concern as limitation. It never sounded malicious, just thoughtful.
If a student says their mother worries too much, I might ask whether that worry feels supportive or restrictive. That's not manipulation, that's perspective. Teenagers need help differentiating love from control. You can't criminalize conversation.
Former students who graduated years earlier began contacting police anonymously. One young woman, now in college, described how Mr. Harper gradually isolated her emotionally from her family. He never told her to leave home, but he encouraged her to question whether her parents' guidance masked a fear of losing control.
He'd say things like, you deserve to define yourself without interference. At the time, it felt empowering. But looking back, I realize I stopped sharing things with my parents because I didn't want them to seem controlling. I thought I was becoming independent, but I was actually becoming more dependent on him.
That detail would matter later because independence was always framed as separation. Students were encouraged to imagine lives beyond Westbridge, beyond the expectations that had shaped them. He spoke of emotional detox, of stepping away from noise to hear one's true voice. It sounded almost therapeutic.
We searched his office computer and found encrypted messaging applications installed on a secondary device. The conversations weren't explicit. There were no threats, no demands for money or inappropriate images. Just long threads about courage, about fresh starts, about cutting ties that hold you back.
The third disappearance sealed the town's unease into something close to panic. Sophia Martinez was 17, quiet but academically gifted. She had recently begun meeting Mr. Harper twice a week. When she vanished, her parents insisted she would never leave voluntarily, yet her bank account showed a small withdrawal the night before.
She told me once that Mr. Harper said some journeys have to be taken alone. I thought he meant college or internships. I never imagined it meant disappearing without a word. I keep replaying every conversation, wondering where we went wrong.
3 students, 3 voluntary departures, and no direct evidence of coercion. Each had left with minimal belongings and modest cash, as if following a careful plan rather than fleeing in fear. The town began whispering, but whispers are not proof.
When we brought Mr. Harper in for questioning, he remained composed. He corrected minor inaccuracies in our timeline and asked for clarification on phrasing. Innocent people tend to over-explain. He streamlined everything. He controlled the narrative without raising his voice.
They were on the brink of adulthood. If they chose to step away from environments they found suffocating, that's their right. I didn't drive them anywhere. I didn't buy them bus tickets. I talked to them about possibilities.
Possibilities can be powerful when offered to someone who feels unseen. Investigators began mapping the sessions, noticing that each missing student had increased their counseling visits in the weeks before leaving. The language in emails grew more intimate, more affirming, subtly positioning him as the one constant presence. What no one could yet answer was why he never followed them. He did not disappear with a student, did not share an address or surface in another state. Instead, digital traces suggested he monitored them through anonymous accounts, brief check-ins that reinforced the narrative of independence, control without physical proximity.
That was the piece that unsettled me. If this were about escape or a relationship, he would have gone with them. But he stayed. He watched. It felt less like love and more like an architect observing a building he designed.
As pressure mounted, parents in Westbridge began questioning themselves. Had they pushed too hard? Had they dismissed emotional signals in favor of achievement? The doubt spread quietly, seeded by conversations that once felt supportive.
Sometimes I hear his voice in my head asking whether my expectations were too heavy. I hate that I even consider it. I hate that he made me question my own love.
In the interrogation room, the air seemed thinner as hours passed. Daniel Harper sat upright, hands folded, his expression steady. Outside the room, 3 families waited for answers that might never fully satisfy them.
You manufactured vulnerability. You identified their insecurities and positioned yourself as the solution. You reframed their reality until leaving felt like empowerment. Do you understand how deliberate that looks?
I understand that you're trying to assign motive where there is none. I help them find courage. If they use that courage to leave, that's not my crime. Maybe the real question is why staying felt worse.
And that was the question that lingered, heavy and unresolved. If a trusted authority figure convinces a teenager that freedom requires disappearance, is that guidance or something far darker? And in a town built on trust, how do you recognize the moment care turns into control? The longer Daniel Harper spoke, the more his words began to feel like a maze with no walls. Every statement sounded reasonable on its own, carefully measured and free of obvious malice. But when investigators placed them side by side, a pattern emerged that felt less like coincidence and more like design. What no one realized at first was that his greatest skill was not persuasion, but patience.
We pulled session logs from the school's internal system. The frequency of his meetings with the 3 missing students increased in the 6 weeks before each disappearance. That doesn't prove anything by itself, but the timing was consistent enough to make us uncomfortable. Patterns in criminal behavior often hide inside routines that look harmless.
When students are on the verge of change, sessions increase. That's standard practice. You intensify support during transitional periods. Graduation, applications, family conflict, these are stressful milestones.
What investigators would later realize was that Daniel never rushed the process. He began by validating frustration, then gradually shifted the focus from problem-solving to identity formation. He asked questions that felt philosophical but carried emotional weight. Who are you without expectations? Who benefits from your obedience?
I remember him saying something similar to me years ago. He asked whether my dreams were actually mine or just inherited from my parents. It made me feel seen, like someone finally understood the pressure, but it also made me doubt every conversation I'd ever had at home.
Doubt, once introduced, rarely stays contained. It grows quietly, especially in adolescents searching for independence. Daniel seemed to understand that better than anyone. He never demanded secrecy, yet secrecy formed naturally as students began filtering which conversations to share with their families.
We reviewed phone records and discovered that each missing student deleted large portions of their message history in the days before leaving. Not just with him, but with friends and parents. That level of digital cleaning isn't impulsive. It suggests preparation.
Preparation without visible coercion is difficult to prosecute. The students opened new email accounts weeks in advance. Two of them created secondary social media profiles under modified names. None of this is illegal, but together it painted a portrait of deliberate departure.
Emily started talking about emotional detox. That was her phrase. She said sometimes you have to step away from everyone to see who you really are. I thought it was something she read online. Now I know where it came from.
Investigators traced small financial movements linked to Daniel's personal accounts. There were no large transfers, no direct payments to students, but there were subscriptions to prepaid debit card services and anonymous money-sharing platforms. It wasn't enough to charge him with financing their disappearance, but it raised another unsettling question.
We couldn't find proof that he handed them cash, but we did find evidence that he educated them about financial independence. Budgeting spreadsheets, articles about opening accounts without parental cosigners, discussions about direct deposit and digital wallets. On paper, it's life skills training.
That's exactly what it is. You teach teenagers how to apply to college, how to manage money, how to prepare for adulthood. I refuse to apologize for empowering them.
Empowerment is a powerful word. It implies strength and growth. But what if empowerment can be manipulated into isolation? What if independence is reframed not as expansion, but as separation from everyone who questions the source of that independence? The breakthrough came from a fourth student, one who never disappeared. Her name was Lily Chen, and she had graduated 2 years earlier. She contacted police after seeing coverage of Marcus's case, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of something close to guilt.
He didn't tell me to leave home. He just kept asking whether my family truly supported my dreams or just tolerated them. He said sometimes love is disguised as limitation. I started pulling away from my parents because I thought they were afraid of my potential. I almost left. I had a bus ticket purchased.
Lily never boarded that bus. The night before she planned to leave, her older brother found the printed itinerary in her backpack. Confrontation followed, messy and emotional. Daniel was never mentioned in that argument, but his language echoed through it.
Lily's testimony gave us something we hadn't had before, insight into process. She described a slow narrowing of perspective, where he became the only adult voice that validated her frustrations without challenging them. That's a subtle form of control.
Teenagers gravitate toward adults who listen. If other authority figures dismiss them, that's not my responsibility. Maybe you should be questioning the environment they wanted to escape.
He was right about one thing: the environment mattered. Westbridge was competitive, structured, and deeply invested in measurable success. Students who felt average in a town of overachievers often internalized that average as failure. Daniel identified that insecurity and nurtured it carefully.
We consulted behavioral analysts. They pointed out something critical. He didn't present himself as superior. He positioned himself as misunderstood too. He'd share selective stories about his own youth, about feeling unseen or underestimated. That creates intimacy fast.
Intimacy accelerates trust, and trust, once secured, can reshape perception. Each missing student had journal entries discovered later, fragments of thoughts about starting fresh, about leaving behind people who didn't get it. The language mirrored Daniel's phrasing almost word for word.
When I read her journal, it felt like I was reading his voice in her handwriting. She wrote about architecting her own life. That's not a phrase she used before. It's like someone planted new vocabulary in her mind.
Investigators subpoenaed Daniel's online activity and found multiple accounts created under pseudonyms. These profiles had minimal footprints but were connected through subtle patterns, similar login times, shared IP addresses, recurring phrases. Some of them followed accounts belonging to the missing students.
He wasn't meeting them physically after they left. He was observing. Occasionally, one of those anonymous accounts would send a message reinforcing their choice. Short, affirming statements about bravery and self-discovery. It was enough to sustain the narrative without exposing himself.
You're interpreting support as surveillance. If a former student messages me, I respond. If they create new profiles, that's their decision. You're building a conspiracy out of mentorship.
Mentorship implies growth that eventually outgrows the mentor, but Daniel's involvement never fully ended. Even as students established new lives in different states, the digital presence lingered. It was subtle, like a shadow that never quite detached. Then came the discovery that shifted the investigation from unsettling to disturbing. Years earlier, a former student named Rachel Morgan had attempted suicide during her senior year. She survived and later moved out of state for college. Records showed Daniel had been deeply involved in her recovery.
We interviewed Rachel. She described him as a lifeline during her darkest period. But she also said that once she stabilized and formed new support systems in college, he became distant. According to her, he seemed almost resentful of her independence.
He once told me I didn't need him anymore, and he smiled when he said it, but it didn't feel happy. It felt like something had been taken from him. I thought I imagined it at the time.
That detail reframed everything. If Daniel's primary motive was control, his hidden motive might have been something more fragile: fear of abandonment disguised as professional dedication. The moment a student no longer needed him, his relevance diminished.
In cases driven by control, the perpetrator often escalates when the dynamic shifts. But Daniel didn't escalate through violence. He escalated through strategy. Instead of losing students to growth, he engineered their departure in a way that preserved his influence.
That's a dramatic interpretation. I don't engineer anyone's life. I provide tools. What they build with those tools is their choice.
Choice is complex when it is shaped by months of reframed reality. Investigators reconstructed timelines and realized each disappearance followed a similar emotional arc: increased isolation, idealization of independence, digital preparation, then quiet exit. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. But the darkest realization came not from what he did, but from what he avoided. There were no threats, no blackmail, no explicit commands. Legally, he had operated in gray areas, careful not to cross lines that would trigger immediate arrest. He understood boundaries and danced just beside them.
We consulted prosecutors early. They warned us that proving coercion without direct evidence would be nearly impossible. Encouraging a teenager to think independently isn't a crime. Even encouraging them to leave home isn't automatically illegal if there's no force involved.
As weeks turned into months, the missing students were located in different parts of the country. All three were alive. All three declined to return home. When contacted, they described their departure as personal growth, not escape.
Hearing her voice was both relief and heartbreak. She sounded calm, almost rehearsed. She said she needed space and that she was finally living authentically. I didn't recognize the language anymore.
The psychological pressure on investigators intensified. If the students insisted they left willingly, where did accountability begin? Could emotional manipulation exist without visible distress from the manipulated?
We rewatched the interrogation footage multiple times. He never displayed panic. He never contradicted himself. Instead, he corrected small factual errors, guiding the conversation back to safe territory. Guilty people often leak stress. He absorbed it.
You're looking for a villain because it simplifies the story. Maybe the real discomfort comes from realizing that your system failed them. Maybe they left because they wanted to.
That suggestion planted a seed of doubt that spread through the town once more. Parents questioned their methods, teachers reassessed their expectations, and students wondered whether seeking guidance might come with invisible strings attached. Daniel Harper remained composed through it all. What no one could yet articulate was the most disturbing aspect of the case: the possibility that he had rewritten their internal narratives so thoroughly that they no longer recognized the influence. If someone believes a thought is entirely their own, how do you prove it was carefully planted?
We're not just dealing with missing persons. We're dealing with manufactured perception. The students aren't accusing him. They're defending him. That's what makes this different.
As Part 2 of the investigation closed, prosecutors prepared preliminary charges related to financial facilitation and policy violations. It was something, but it wasn't the whole truth, because beneath the legal technicalities lay a darker realization. If a trusted authority figure can reshape a young person's reality without ever touching them, without ever issuing a direct command, then the crime isn't disappearance. The crime is transformation. And in Westbridge, the most unsettling question was no longer where the students had gone, but who they had become after they left. By the time formal charges were filed, the town of Westbridge no longer felt as certain as it once had. The lawns were still trimmed, the school rankings unchanged, but conversations had shifted in tone. People lowered their voices when they mentioned the counselor's name. Trust, once automatic, now felt like something fragile and negotiable.
We moved forward with what we could prove, contributing to the delinquency of minors, unauthorized financial guidance, policy violations tied to private communications. None of it carried the weight of kidnapping or trafficking because technically the students walked away on their own.
So that's it. Administrative misconduct dressed up as criminal intent. You couldn't find force because there wasn't any. You couldn't find threats because I never made them. You found conversations and called them dangerous.
The courtroom was smaller than most people expected. There were no dramatic confessions, no explosive testimonies. Daniel Harper sat in a dark suit, posture straight, expression neutral. When he spoke, his tone was measured, as if addressing a faculty meeting rather than a judge.
I kept waiting for him to look at us just once, to show something, regret, shame, even anger, but he didn't. He stared forward like this was a misunderstanding that would eventually correct itself. That calm felt worse than if he had yelled.
Prosecutors presented digital evidence, encrypted applications, anonymous accounts linked by IP patterns, financial subscriptions that enabled untraceable debit cards. They showed email excerpts highlighting phrases that repeated across students' journals. Words like liberation, detox, architect your life.
We argued that he didn't just advise independence. He engineered emotional dependency first. You isolate the student psychologically, position yourself as the only validating voice, then encourage separation. It's not physical force, but it's structured influence.
Influence is part of education. Teachers' influence, coaches' influence, parents' influence. You're criminalizing guidance because you don't like the outcome.
The missing students, now located and legally adults, submitted written statements instead of appearing in person. Each one described their departure as voluntary. They acknowledged Daniel's support but denied feeling pressured. They insisted they had needed distance.
Reading her statement felt like losing her all over again. She said we loved her conditionally. She said we feared her growth. Those weren't words we ever used, but somehow they became her truth. I don't know how to argue with a truth that feels borrowed.
The judge ultimately delivered a sentence that satisfied no one and shocked no one. A short period of incarceration tied to financial misconduct, revocation of his counseling license within the state, mandatory psychological evaluation, no conviction for abduction, no formal recognition of coercion.
It was the kind of outcome that sits in your stomach. We knew something profound had happened, but the law requires clarity. Emotional architecture is harder to define than physical confinement.
When Daniel was led away, he did not resist. He nodded once to his attorney and kept his gaze steady. There was no dramatic outburst, no final revelation, just a quiet compliance that suggested he believed history would eventually reinterpret his actions more kindly.
You're all reacting to discomfort. The world changes when young people choose themselves. Maybe you're not angry at me. Maybe you're angry that they didn't choose you.
Prison records indicate he maintained good behavior during his sentence. He attended mandated therapy sessions and participated in educational workshops. Evaluators noted high intelligence, strong verbal control, and minimal outward signs of remorse. They also noted something else, a persistent belief that he had been misunderstood.
The evaluation didn't label him a psychopath or a sociopath. It highlighted traits associated with control-based behavior and ego injury. When individuals derive identity from being needed, the loss of that need can feel catastrophic. Some adapt, others recalibrate the environment.
2 years after his release, a small school district in another state hired a new guidance counselor under a slightly altered name. His credentials, legally restricted in Illinois, had been transferred through a complex administrative appeal. The district cited his experience and strong references from colleagues outside Westbridge.
When I saw the article announcing his hiring, I felt my chest tighten. Different town, different students, same calm smile in the photo. I wondered how many parents there would feel grateful to have someone so attentive.
Meanwhile, the 3 former students remained distant from their families. They built lives in new cities, changed phone numbers, and kept communication minimal. None of them reported abuse. None filed civil suits. They described their separation as necessary for self-discovery.
I reached out once more after the case closed, not as an investigator but as someone trying to understand. One of them told me he didn't make me leave, he just helped me realize I wanted to. That sentence is legally powerful. It ends most arguments.
What investigators would later admit, quietly and off-record, was that the case changed how they viewed influence. There are crimes that leave bruises and broken locks, and then there are crimes that leave altered memories and rewritten loyalties.
You keep using the word crime. Show me the statute for helping someone believe in themselves. Show me where it says confidence is illegal.
The town of Westbridge eventually regained its rhythm. New counselors were hired, policies were tightened, private sessions required partial transparency, but the invisible shift remained. Students began second-guessing which adults to confide in. Parents monitored language more carefully, listening for unfamiliar phrases.
Sometimes I replay old conversations in my head. I try to remember the exact moment her tone changed. Was it gradual? Was there a specific sentence that tilted everything? I can't find it. It's like watching a sunset and trying to pinpoint the second daylight disappears.
That is the unsettling nature of psychological manipulation. It rarely announces itself. It does not slam doors or raise voices. It introduces small reframes, subtle validations, gentle suggestions that accumulate over time.
The most disturbing part is this: the students are alive. They are functioning. By every measurable standard, they're fine. And yet families feel something was taken from them that can't be restored. Try writing that into a charge sheet.
Years from now, the official record will show a counselor disciplined for misconduct. It will not capture the quiet erosion of trust that rippled through a community. It will not record the way certain phrases now trigger suspicion in living rooms across town.
They needed someone who believed in them without conditions. I was that person. If that threatened the system, maybe the system needed threatening.
The most dangerous people are rarely the loudest. They are the ones who make you feel understood before they make you feel alone. They do not drag you away. They convince you that leaving was your own idea.
I've worked cases with clear villains. This one keeps me up because there's no single moment to point at. No slam of a door. Just a series of conversations that shifted gravity.
And perhaps that is the final question left hanging in the quiet of Westbridge. If control feels like care, if isolation feels like empowerment, how do you recognize the line before you've already crossed it?